So tonight I'm going to be talking about Houdini. It's the latest spec for the CSS engine. There's a bunch of manufacturers behind it that are working on it. It's currently a task force doing a really early stage proposition for basically opening up the back end of the compositing engine and all the stuff around that. So basically, the start of the story, which you guys are pretty much all aware of and probably already using, is Shadow DOM started off the componentization movement with the web frameworks. We then had web components themselves come along and start implementing the Shadow DOM, and that was really cool. Then we had ES6, aka 2015, come out last year, which basically brought native classes to JavaScript. As we all know, it's really still not actually classes, but it's better than no classes at all. So that was sort of the next step in the process, and Houdini is going to do the same thing again, but for CSS. So this is still loading because the Wi-Fi is probably going to want me to re-authenticate again. Oh no, it's actually up. Cool. Okay, let's make this full screen. Alright, so who am I? I'm a student at QUT at this point in time, graduating into this year. Only reason I know anything about this is because I was following the Google I/O presentations this year. They gave their first talk about it at the time, and yeah, got me really excited. Speaking of which, will be a link, I'll post it in the meetup to my slides, and there's a link in there to the actual I/O presentation, which I've actually lifted a lot of my content from. So I've already been through what is Houdini. These are the guys who are involved with creating the Houdini spec right now. There's some really random names in here. Why is Intel and IBM interested in this technology? But the rest all makes sense. And yeah, it's really cool that it's not just one browser vendor this time around trying to champion this. It's like everyone's on board, let's do this, let's get the ball rolling. So the Extensible Web Manifesto, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, web platforms should expose low-level capabilities that explain existing features and allow authors to understand and replicate them. So JavaScript, this has been happening for a really long time. We're all comfortable with it. CSS, on the other hand, we have to kind of wait for the browser vendors to do stuff about it. So this is where Houdini really steps up the game, and we can start actually developing new CSS features to work on our products, and allows us to implement things like Flexbox miles ahead of the browser vendors actually getting around to doing it. So that's the main reason why Houdini is really important. So I've already gone through these. So how does it work? So currently, my key's dropping out on me. So currently we've got the existing stack that we're aware of. You have your parser at the top end that brings everything in. The DOM is where the JavaScript resides right now, and that's basically all it can do. You've got CSS OM, and then everything past this point is all locked down. This is where Houdini is going to start opening things up. So JavaScript will no longer be limited to the DOM. You'll also be able to access your cascade, your layout, your paint, and even your composite, and really start optimizing things down to how you want them. So there's a bunch of CSS components of Houdini at this point in time. So we've got CSS typed OM, basically opens up the typing for CSS and makes it a lot easier to use. So currently there's a lot of string parsing backwards and forwards. This basically implements JavaScript types within the CSS and makes it a lot easier to interact with. CSS properties and values flows on down again from there. So things like calc and that are in this spec, and makes it a lot easier to interact again on top of the typed. Composited scrolling animation, pretty self-explanatory. There's actually a bit of argument as to exactly what's going to be in this spec. Again, it's like they're only like 6 months in at this point, so things are really up in the air. CSS Paint API, it's going to be a lot of shadows, styling, things like that. Basically your graphics stack compositing. Layout APIs, things like Flexbox. I'll talk a little bit about this later, but things like Flexbox will go in here. So rather than having to wait for a browser vendor to implement something new like Flexbox, you can just bring in a Houdini file that has all of the definitions for your CSS class and just start using it, regardless of what browsers you're having to worry about. So there's font metrics in CSS Parser. I won't go over them because there's been like no talk as to what's actually going to be in them. The top 4, there's already pretty solid documentation for, and there's actually the top 3 will be in Chrome Canary sometime in the next 6 months. So this is how we're doing it currently. Accessing a DOM object, adding stuff to the style tag, ES5 and ES6. ES6 is a little bit cleaner, but we're still passing a string to the document and then repassing that back into the CSS engine. And why are we doing this? So the typed object model is where we come in. So we're still getting the element, but we're actually accessing something called a style map. Now this is brand new for with Houdini for the JavaScript engine, and basically gives you direct access to the CSS properties for the object. So rather than going to the document and adding something to that style tag within your object, you're actually accessing the back end behind the scenes where it all ends up and putting stuff direct into that, which is a lot more efficient because you're not double passing stuff, it's just going straight in, changing how it displays, done. And there's a few things here, so passing a number value, there's a preset object sort of thing there for it, pretty straightforward. This one's a little bit more interesting. We have a simple length with the value and the unit. Okay, that's interesting. Here's why. We can then get the element and individually find out what the unit is that we've passed it and how big it is. We can then change them independently without having to repass a string or anything like that. So if you had 50 px and you wanted to change to EMs or something else, you can just do it. And then the CSS calc, they extended the passing functionality, so you can pass in a string that contains 2 different values and it will produce a calc within CSS as you would normally. But if they match, it'll actually do the maths for you, figure out what the final value is, and pass that as a single value into CSS, so the actual engine isn't doing any extra work. And again, if you pass in a calc with 2 different values, you can access them individually. Again, no passing of a string. You can go, oh hey, I need to change one part of the calc, and you can just do that. And that last one actually exposed a dictionary, which they went, hey, if we're accessing a dictionary, why don't we let them pass a dictionary? So, calc length, pass it an object containing the 2 unit values, and you're off to the races. So, the end thing, I guess, for this section is that you've also got some basic math things. So you can go subtract a length, and it'll do that maths for you, or create a calc, or whatever else, and do some back-end logic for you. And that's your output that you get. You can do stylemap.set and then pass in that const object. So if you need to use this calc value in multiple places, you can just do that way. So custom properties is the other thing they're working on. So we've recently had CSS Variables, as they're called, added into the spec. Browser support, a bit iffy as I've discovered recently, i.e. forget it. Edge, meh, kind of. But Firefox and Chrome are all on board. But you still can't do fancy stuff like put transitions and stuff in. Like, this is pretty obvious, like that's not going to work. You have to have a var around it, and there's a bunch of other things. Like you can't just bundle a complete transition into a variable and then put it in multiple places. So that's kind of where the custom properties come in. I'm going to sort of skip over the next few things because there's a lot of movement happening on these, not like the properties. So you can register a particular property. Again, this is a JavaScript call within Houdini. Pass it a dictionary, give it a name, which is the whatever basically variable you want to call it. The syntax, which is basically the HTML code that it references. Whether it's going to inherit anything, and what its initial value is, which is really cool because if you have something that you want to have a default value for, you can define that. So things like flex that have default values, you can do that in here as well. So full support, and yeah, really, really cool. My mouse pointer has moved. And that really is just scratching the surface as to what you can do. They've got a lot of plans for where they're going with this, and it'll be really, really interesting to see where they go. So there's also a compositor worklet. For those of you working with compositors, and I guess you know a lot more about this than I do, these are complete, this is all Chinese to me. I wasn't actually saying much, but anyway. So there's a lot of stuff happening here. Basically, there's actually a lot of code that I haven't put in here. It allows you to do high priority graphical level stuff like moving elements with JavaScript in sync with the actual compositing engine as it works. So you have to make sure your codes are really, really efficient, but it allows you to do frame by frame processing. So the Google I/O presentation has two statically placed boxes. One of them is CSS static, one of them is JavaScript static. The JavaScript one just keeps lagging under the current spec. So this is designed to fix that if you want to do some fancy positioning stuff with JavaScript. There's also a paint worklet, which I mentioned earlier. So this is really cool for placeholder images. And if you've got something that's loading in the background, a much larger image, you can display a short-term placeholder, which I think a lot of people do. But this just kind of makes it a lot easier than CSS instead of JavaScript. So the layout API, there's a lot of graphical stuff. If you want to see that, go to the Google I/O presentation. But things like Flexbox, grid style sheets 2.0 is apparently a thing. Masonry layouts, if you've ever tried to do a masonry layout, I tried to do that last week, and like brick wall. Turns out you can actually do it, but it's only vertical. You can't do a horizontal masonry layout, which I found rather annoying. And then other things like auto-sizing text. So having you shrink your window down and the font scales down to match the width of the window as it gets smaller, and then stays at a maximum size once it goes out. That is apparently really hard to do. So things like the layout API will allow us to define that in CSS rather than massive, massive JavaScript things. Parser, question marks. This is like the newest part of the spec. There's a lot of backwards and forwards as to what is actually going to be happening. Basically, it's one of the guys at Google has this bright idea, and he hasn't actually had a chance to put it on paper yet. So we'll see what comes out of this, but it sounds really cool. So when can you use it? There's some polyfills for the first three parts of the spec that I showed. I'll just jump to that slide. So the CSS types, properties, values, and composited scrolling and animation have polyfills available on GitHub right now. They're really inefficient though, because it basically does the Houdini stuff and then passes it back to the way we're doing it currently. So it's not performant. Please do not try to use it in production. But it's there if you want to play around with it and just see what's possible. Jump back. So I mentioned earlier that the Chrome Canary will have it sometime pretty soon. So if you want to start messing around with it, like actually in real, be behind a flag, that's kind of where we're headed. Yeah, that's everything. Thank you for your time.
There we go. It's on. Do we have any questions for him? Surely somebody's interested. There we go. I'll give you this.
No, don't need it. What is the masonry layout?
Masonry layout. So basically you have, depending on how you implement it, you can have boxes of variable sizes that will automatically reflow to fill a container. So kind of like float and flex, but they try and do like wrap line stuff to make pretty lines. This doesn't try to wrap the lines to make it pretty. It just fits them in as they fit and then leaves jagged edges at the bottom, or you can do like a little bit of fill at the bottom to make it look nice and pretty. So basically the same concept as a masonry wall, which is why it makes it layout.
Okay.
Like a Pinterest board.
Basically, yeah.
Cool. Any other questions? Surely. Very new spec, lots of capability. Surely somebody's got a question. You're all son. Oh, there he is.
So with the other four parts, was there any timeframe on that?
No. So at this stage, everything's up in the air. So these guys have really only been at it for a few months. When they announced it at Google I/O, they were hey, like this is a thing, but like nothing happening really soon. So keep an eye on the Google developers channel stuff. I'm sure they'll start screaming about it once things start coming out.
Google groups.
Yeah. So those guys will know a lot more. There's a couple of guys, if you watch the Google I/O presentation right at the end, there's 2 guys that you can get in contact with on Twitter and on GitHub and shout ideas at them. They really want your ideas. So if you have something that, hey, this would be cool, let them know because they can still implement it. Like this is still really early days.
Cool.
I'm sure there's some graphical problem that we love JavaScript to fix, so I think that's a good idea. I'm gonna hop on that. Okay.